So essentially what I've done is removed the drums from the song so that I have this raw audio file with no drums, or at least very little drums, at which point I can sample by itself, and then later on add in my own kicks and snares. Great. Hello my inspirations, my name is InspirAspir, and today I'm going to teach you how to remove drums from a song in Ableton. Now this is particularly useful if you're making a cover of a song. Say for example you're making a Launchpad cover, and on one hand you want to play the kicks and the snares, and on the other you want to play the melodies, that sort of thing. I have an example of what we'll be doing in this video. I'm using the song Nurture by Glacier. Great song, by the way. And I have a working demo of what we'll be doing. So first, let me play the song by itself. So that's the song, and I've gone ahead and removed the drums using this trick, and the result sounds like this. Now it sounds a little rough around the edges, I'll admit, but once you layer your own kicks and snares to replace the drums that you've removed, it fills in those holes, and it sounds like a decent track. So altogether with my own kicks and snare samples, this is what this sounds like. Now again, it's not perfect, but when you consider that this is meant to be for a live cover, that and the fact that I spent only about 10 minutes on this, all things considered, it's not that bad. Now if you really wanted to give it that perfect clean shine, you could then EQ the kicks and snares or add in some reverb, stuff like that, so they fit in perfectly. But for demonstration's sake, I think it gets the point across. So now that I've demonstrated what it is we'll be doing in this video, let's go ahead and jump into it, and you can learn how to remove drums from a song. So I figured it would be best to start with a new live set, since that's where most of you will be starting anyways. So in my new live set, I'm going to drag in the song that I want to remove the drums from, like so. For now, I'm going to delete these MIDI tracks. I'm going to add some back in later, but for now I don't need them. Same for this audio track. Now one thing I highly recommend you do before removing the songs is to sync up the BPM of Ableton and your song. So to do that, I'm gonna look up the BPM of my song. And it turns out my song is roughly 101, maybe 101.5 BPM. So up at the top left of Ableton, I'm gonna type in my BPM. And then I'm gonna double click on my song, go down here where this yellow box says warp, and unclick it. Next, I'm gonna find the part of the song that I want to remove drums from. So I'm gonna find the part that I want, which is right here. And to make my life easier, I'm actually gonna move this so that way the drop starts at the beginning of this bar. Now you can fine tune this by zooming in so that this drop starts right on this bar. Now effectively what I just did between syncing the BPMs of the song in Ableton and moving the song's audio file is I just made it so every kick and snare is lined up with these beats. So for example, kick, snare, kick, snare. Great, so we just spent all that time lining this up so it can make sampling super easy. So naturally now we go into the sampling part. What I'm gonna do now is at the beginning of this drop, I'm gonna right click and hit split. And what that did is it just chopped the song right there and then. Now this is where my kick is. There's a kick there. Now I'm gonna go to the next part in the song where another drum appears. So right here I have a snare. So I'm gonna right click there and hit split. And what I just did is I have a sample here, which is my drum and some of the other parts of the song. And now here I have my snare. And then again, I'm just gonna keep going until I see my next drum. So right here I have a kick. Here I have a snare. And this song has a very simple drum pattern, so that way the drums hit the same time apart. It just goes kick, snare, kick, snare. So I'm just gonna go down the line and repeat that pattern, chopping up my song every time I hear a drum. So I have the first part of this drop chopped up into samples every time a drum hits. Next, I'm gonna go on the right side of Ableton, I'm gonna right click and insert a MIDI track. Then I'm gonna insert a MIDI clip covering the length of all these samples that I did. Once you do that, you can right click and insert a MIDI clip. Then you're gonna wanna go to the left side of Ableton, and under drums, find drum rack, click and drag that onto your MIDI track. Next, you're going to want to assign the samples that we chopped up and put them into your drum rack. You could do them one by one if you want, or you can highlight all your samples and then drag them into your drum rack. Now, if you have too many samples, this probably won't work just by the sheer volume, but if you're working with small segments of the song like I am, then this is a good way to save some time. So now you have a drum rack full of samples. Now the next thing you need to do is find the order that they're played in. If you clicked and dragged them in bulk like I did, the order should start at the bottom leftmost sample that you started with, and then go to the right. And then once you enter this row, it should go to the leftmost of the row above it. And then I forgot to add in this sample. And of course, if you drag them in manually one by one, you should know the order. The point is, you want to know what order they're in. So then what I highly recommend you do next is you can name your samples, and for this demonstration, I'm just going to number them. You'll see the significance of this in a few seconds. This is really just for your own benefit, you don't have to do this. Okay, so I've numbered my samples in the order they're supposed to be played. Next, we double click into our MIDI clip, and we can drag this piano roll up. Essentially what we're going to do is trigger our samples when they're supposed to be played. So in my case, the pattern is very simple, and it looks just like this. Essentially all you're doing in this MIDI clip is triggering the specific sample that you chopped up when it's supposed to be played, if that makes any sense. Next, I'm going to mute my song, otherwise I'll have two identical audio files playing at the same time, and that'll cause clipping and it'll be overwhelming. So if you've done it right, essentially in your drum rack, you should just have your song. Now, it may sound a little choppy, but that makes sense because we did, after all, chop up the song and then just triggered the samples manually, so that makes sense. Now we get into the parts where we can actually remove the drums from this song. We're gonna go back into our drum rack, double-click this MIDI track, and then we'll go ahead and start with the first drum, so this one. If you can't already see the audio file, go ahead and double-click on this sample, and then you can zoom in by clicking in this audio file and dragging down while holding left click. So now I can see my audio file of this particular sample, that is. Next, we're gonna go down here where it says fade in. It's currently at 0 milliseconds, and that makes sense because the sample is just triggering instantly. Essentially what fade in is, it's the attack. It determines the time from how long the sample is triggered until it is at full volume. So if I were to put it at its max, which is 2 seconds, essentially it's saying it would take 2 whole seconds from the time the sample is triggered until it reaches full volume, which in this case it isn't even on for 2 seconds, so it effectively mutes this, or at least makes it very quiet. Now I'm gonna loop this sample so it sounds like this, and I know that may sound a little annoying, but while it's playing, I'm just gonna slowly drag up this fade in knob. So here we go. And you'll notice, as I drag in the fade-in knob, that kick starts to get removed a little bit. So if I were to play it now, that kick really isn't coming through as much, but the rest of the song is. Now, it's up to you, depending on the song, to change this fade-in knob, because obviously every sample, every kick, every snare is going to be different, at least from song to song. So next, I'm going to move to my second sample, zoom in, and listen to that one. And again, I'm just going to drag up my fade-in knob. And again, I have to emphasize, you just have to kind of tweak it to whatever sounds good. The perfect balance between removing the drum, but also maintaining the song itself. And then all I'm going to do is repeat this for every sample. So after changing the fade-in for every sample, I'm left with this. Once I'm happy with the result, essentially what we've just done is removed the drums from this song. Now, one thing you may notice when you change the fade in is that the samples may become a little bit quieter. And that makes sense, right? Because you're changing the amount of volume that comes out as soon as the sample is triggered. So one thing you can do is you can tweak the volume of each sample by going into the bottom right of your particular sample, and adjusting the volume. And again, obviously you'll have to tweak this manually and kind of go by ear based on your samples, but I highly recommend you do your best to remain consistent between all of your samples. Otherwise you'll get variations in volume and that might sound a little weird. Once I'm happy with the result, one thing I'm gonna do is export this as an audio file. Now you don't have to do this, but exporting this as an audio file will essentially allow you to sample your track with the drums removed. So to do that, I'm gonna highlight my MIDI clip with my samples. I'm gonna go to File, Export Audio Video. When it says Rendered Track, I'm gonna select my drum rack, and I'm gonna export it as whatever I wanna name it. Then once that's exported, I'm just gonna drag it back into Ableton as an audio file. And then I'll turn off my drum rack just so again, I don't have duplicate layers repeating on top of each other. So I have something that sounds like this. And then this is the point where you can add in your own drums on top of your song. So going back to the example that I started with at the beginning of this video, I have the song with removed drums, but I also have my own drums layered on top of it. So it sounds like this. Which doesn't sound half bad. But ultimately what we've just done in this video is we've created an audio file with essentially no drums. If you put a lot of time into it, you can get this very, very near perfect in terms of drum removal. And then at this point what you can do is you can sample your song like you normally would, and then you can just play your own drum samples where the drums are supposed to be triggered. Which, like I said earlier, is super useful if you're making a cover, say for example, a Launchpad cover. Essentially, to sum it up, you chop up your samples wherever your drums are, you put them in a drum rack, you increase the fade or the attack so that the volume sort of cancels out your drums. You can export your drum rack full of those samples as its own audio file, which you can then sample later and then just play your drums on top of. And you have a song with no drums, but you can play your own drums. I hope that makes sense. I hope you found this tutorial to be helpful. If you're interested in making a Launchpad cover, but you don't know how, I actually have a series you can check out. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.